Chapters 9 and 10 tonight. Got 2 chapters again to cover. Last week I tried cutting out all my answers. Like I wrote, 4 or 5 words to every question on here, and I don't even think we came close to making it through. So I don't know what the solution is here, but we'll do our best to try to cover the main idea and the points in it. And of course, question number 1 deals with kind of the main subject of these 2 chapters. And that question is this: have you ever known someone who refused to listen to advice or instruction? Nobody's ever known anybody like that, right? Probably all of us know currently somebody like that. How does that make you feel when you're around somebody like that? Yeah, it's aggravating, isn't it? Because if you try to tell them something to help them out, they're not going to listen to you because they already know what they're doing anyway, right? And then I think even more frustrating than that is when you try to help somebody out and they just completely ignore you and go ahead and do their own thing, and it doesn't work out, and then they try to do it again. Like, well, I must have missed something on the first time. But it's all of us understand, being in that situation, being frustrated or disappointed with somebody. And the reason that I asked that question is because if you think about Paul's standpoint to how he looked at his fellow Jews, that was really kind of the situation that he was in. Paul was trying to help them out. He was trying to tell them, but, they just wouldn't listen. They already knew it all. And it wasn't anything that he could do to try to persuade them and turn them around. And you'll see some of that frustration here in chapters 9 and 10 and 11. These 3 chapters really deal with, remember that kind of the theme of the book of Romans, at least the first part of it is how God planned to make man righteous. And some people think that chapters 9 through 11 here are kind of out of place because, all of a sudden in this middle of the discussion of righteousness in chapter 8, Paul talks about, how glorious this plan is and all the blessings that we've received from it. Then he kind of switches over and looks at the Jew. But really the theme, I think, of these 3 chapters has to do with what was the Jews, what was Israel's place in God's plan to make man righteous? And that's kind of what Paul addresses here, kind of Israel as a nation itself. So if you start here in chapter 9, if you've read through that chapter, you know that Paul talks a lot about how God is in charge. We call it God's sovereignty, the idea that he reigns and rules over all and over everything. And God, because he reigns and he rules over everyone and everything, God has the freedom to make choices that he wants to make. And so Paul talks a little bit about how God's sovereignty and how his ability to choose played a role in Israel, in the choosing and using of the nation of Israel, and how it brought about or came about to the benefit of man's righteousness. So question number 2 here, if you look at the first couple verses, verses 2 and 3 there in chapter 9, what situation made Paul feel so sad and anguished?
He knew that all the Israelites wouldn't be saved.
Yeah, it was his own flesh and blood, wasn't it? It was his own nation. And again, it's kind of weird because when you end in chapter 8, just like Paul is rejoicing, he's talking about all these great things and how many blessings we have in Christ, and what a opportunity that we have to be part of this plan for God to make man righteous. And then in chapter 9, he goes from being happy and being on top of the world to being in tears. And basically, when you think about the Jews, what bothered Paul so much was, God had made this nation so many promises. And they had so much potential, and they ended up killing Jesus. I mean, they ended up killing the Son of God and rejecting the gospel. And so Paul was just, at his wit's end. How could a nation with so much promise and, so many prospects go in such an opposite direction? And so he prayed, and of course he grieved, and he worked to try to convert as many of his own nation as would listen to it. But it did bring him a lot of sorrow and again, anguish because of the state of his nation. Question number 3. So what does Paul say to people who claim to be God's child just because they're descendants of Abraham? Remember, that was one of the staples in the reply of the Jews. Whenever you start talking about salvation, or you start talking about freedom or being delivered from the bondage of sin, we don't need to be delivered. We're the children of Abraham. So how does Paul address that idea?
Pretty much just told them because they were descendants of Abraham, that didn't necessarily mean that they were descendants of God or chosen of God.
Yeah, it didn't mean that they were the ones who God had promised something. And he uses it in a kind of a way I think that we can all understand. How many children did Abraham have that were promised?
One.
Only one. Did Abraham have other children?
Yes.
He did, but not all of them were the children of promise, were they? And so just because you were a child of Abraham didn't mean that you were a child who inherited a promise. And that's the illustration that he's using here. Just because a person descended from Abraham didn't mean that they automatically inherited the promises of God. Not every child of Abraham inherited God's promises. But there was one who did. There was one to whom that promise was made, and he did inherit it. He also uses the illustration of Isaac, and particularly of his two sons, Jacob and Esau. And question number 4 here, what decision does God make about Jacob and Esau before they were born?
Love the one, hated the other.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Does that mean that God showed all this favoritism toward Jacob and he just couldn't stand Esau?
No, he simply wanted the younger Jacob. That's who was going to go for it.
Yeah, before they'd even been born, God made the decree that the older is going to serve the younger. Now remember that Jacob and Esau were twins too. So they wasn't like they were years apart. They were only moments apart, weren't they? But God had already made this decision that the older, that is Esau, was going to serve the younger, and that was Jacob. But I want you to think of it, because he's made this argument, not all Abraham's children are children that inherit God's promises. And now he's talking about Isaac's children. And even Isaac's children, did they all inherit God's promises? No. Just because you were a descendant of Isaac didn't mean that you're going to inherit the promise of God. In fact, when you think about who of Isaac's children were Israel? Was Esau an Israelite? Just Jacob, wasn't it? Jacob was the one who got his name changed to Israel, right? That's the one that the Israelites descended from. Who descended from Esau? Kind of history lesson here. Edomites. Yeah, completely different race. So just because you were a child of Isaac didn't mean that you were an Israelite. And so he's making this argument, just because you're a descendant of Abraham doesn't mean you inherit the promises of God. Just because you're a child of Isaac doesn't mean you're an Israelite. Not every child was an Israelite. So it's not the case that these Jews could just go out here and say, well, Abraham was our father, we're okay. Or, we're an Israelite. Well, okay. But are you a child of God? Are you righteous in God's sight? And so that's the point I think that Paul's really trying to drive home there and kind of get into the Jewish mindset. Question number 5, got a typo here in this question. You have to forgive me, I'm human, but the question says, how did Paul defend the idea that God is unjust in his treatment of people? Well, it should say that God is not unjust in his treatment of people. So how does Paul defend that idea? How could God not make all of Abraham's children of promise? How could God not make all of Isaac's children Israelites and still be just?
God's God. He makes the call of what's right. He said this way.
Yeah, when we're talking about God, I mean, we're talking about who decides what's right and what's wrong? God, right? Who decides what's just and what's unjust? God. That's his role. And so that's the place that he has, and he alone occupies that place. And so whatever God decides is just, isn't it? And Paul kind of points out, it's not this case that as humans we have this argument against God. Like we deserve something from him. What do we deserve from God? Well, yeah, eternal punishment. That's what we deserve, right? We haven't earned anything. We can't sit back here and start complaining like God owes us something, or he should treat us in a certain way. God is merciful to us, doesn't he? Isn't he? And so God has the ability. Mercy is a gift. It's not something we earn. It's not something we deserve. It's not our right. It's a gift that's given to us by God. And so God can choose who he wants to be merciful to. God could choose Abraham to be the father of the Jews, couldn't he? God could choose Jacob to be the father of the Israelites and be just in that decision or in that choice. Because God doesn't owe any of us anything. And anything that he gives to us is just an extension of his grace and of his mercy. It's a gift. It's not something that we've earned. And so that's the argument that Paul's making here. We don't have any right, to start making demands of God like he owes us something or we've done something to deserve, his mercy or his gifts that he pours out upon us. And so God can choose, can't he? He can pick and choose. So question number 6, what determines how God bestows favor on people? God's will, right? And what Paul says there in verse 16 of chapter 9, he says, so then it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. In other words, it's not a choice that's made according to my will. I don't get to determine, well, I want God to show me mercy and I don't want him to show that guy mercy. That's not how it works, right? It's not of the person who runs or wins the race. We've earned something. God owes us something. It's just the case that it's according to the mercy of God. And so God shows mercy on who he wants to show mercy, and he shows compassion on who he wants to show compassion. Now, I might stop here and just say this. When we think about, this is something I think as a human that's hard to kind of digest in our minds. But when we think about God making choices, why do you think God chose Abraham to be the father of the Jews?
He knew Abraham. He knew his heart. He knew what he was going to do before he did it.
Yeah. Why did God choose Judas to betray Jesus? Because he knew the kind of man he was, right? He knew what was in his heart. He knew the things that would happen beforehand. And so when we say, it's God has mercy on who he'll have mercy and shows compassion on who he has compassion, understand this. It's based on God's ability to see the future. And he knows what's going to happen. He knows what kind of people these are going to be. And so before they're even born, he can say, this guy is going to do this, or I'm going to choose him to do this for me, or I'm going to choose this guy to do something against me, because he can see that in the future. And so it's not like, God makes this choice and then he forces us to be something that we wouldn't have been in life. And so it's according to his will, and it's, of course, according to his foreknowledge too. Question number 7, what examples from history does Paul use to demonstrate God's ability to choose?
Pharaoh.
Yeah, Pharaoh. What kind of man was Pharaoh? You had to kind of summarize his characteristics. What are some of them you would think of?
I think Pharaoh had God complex. He thought he was sort of God on earth.
Yeah. He had no. I mean, you can see it from the beginning, but he had absolutely no respect for Jehovah God, did he? One of the first things that comes out of his mouth when Moses comes over and tells him to let the children of Israel go, or Jehovah God says to let the children of Israel go, he said, "Who's that? And why should I obey his voice?" But he was a very egotistical individual, wasn't he? What else comes to mind when you think of Pharaoh? Think stubborn would be a good word to describe him?
Harsh.
Yeah, harsh. I mean, how did he treat the Israelites? Yeah, tried to, killed all the male children, and of course treated them, tried to basically work them to death. So definitely was not, when it came to the treatment of his fellow men, was not a very good person. I say stubborn because, how quick was Pharaoh to acknowledge God and let the children of Israel go?
Never did.
No, I mean he would say he would, wouldn't he? And then he'd change his mind. And even the final time after he let him go, he tried to chase him back down, didn't he? Take him back into Egypt.
Do you think he was very smart? Like just a smart person? Like
Worldly smart he'd have to be, wouldn't he?
I don't know. They were born into that, right?
Yeah.
It was a birthright.
Yeah, I would say worldly he was probably pretty educated, but sometimes that
I don't know.
sometimes
Some of the mummies they find were like, they said they were essentially inbred and deformed because they had bred in the royal line over and over and over. I'm sitting there thinking, maybe he wasn't that quick.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times do you have to have something happen and you figure out, like, this ain't good for me, I'm going to stop doing that?
Yeah, I don't think it was his genetics that was his main problem.
Even intelligent people make poor choices.
Yeah, and that's evidence. Well, Solomon's a good example of that. I mean, the smartest guy ever lived, but he's pretty dumb in a lot of instances, wasn't he? Made some bad choices, maybe I should say it in that way. But that's what I'm trying to say is this. God knew that's the kind of person Pharaoh would be. And it didn't matter if Pharaoh was king of Egypt or if he was the lowliest peasant over here in Egyptian culture. That's the kind of guy he was going to be. He's going to be this evil, wicked, stubborn, hard-hearted individual. And that's why God chose him. God says, I need somebody that's I can show my glory to the world through. And so I'm going to elevate this guy to, as being Pharaoh of Egypt, and I'm going to use him in order to accomplish that so that all the world can see what a glorious God I am. But again, God's choice was Pharaoh. And there's a reason that God chose him, and there's a reason that he used him. Question number 8. So what right do we have to question God?
Well, we don't.
None? Yeah, that's the answer. Does that stop us from questioning God? No. But, Paul kind of puts it this way, and couple things that he says. First of all, we're the created, we're not the creator. And he used an illustration that was pretty common for that day and age, but the idea of a potter and a piece of clay. What does a potter make with a piece of clay? That's right, whatever he wants, right? Does the clay get to say anything? And after he makes it, does the clay have a right to say, "Hey, why'd you make me into this?" No, it's the idea of a potter's right over the clay. And so that's God. God made us, He fashioned us. Clay doesn't have any right to say, "Why'd you make me like that?" They don't have any input into the matter. It all has to do with the hands of the potter and the mind of the potter. And so that's the point that Paul's making here when it comes to God. Did God choose Israel to play a part in His plan to make man righteous? Was it a good choice?
Yes, it was God's.
Yeah. First of all, God can choose whoever He wants to. That's His right. But it also, just as we talked about with Pharaoh, there's a reason why God chooses who He chooses. And so, God chose Israel, but that doesn't mean that every descendant of Abraham's a child of promise. That doesn't mean that every son of Isaac is an Israelite. And so there's a difference between, again, just being a physical descendant of Abraham versus actually being part of Israel or actually being, a true Jew, as the Bible describes it. So how does Israel's unbelief play into this picture of God choosing them? If God chose them, why is Israel in this state of unbelief here? And that's basically what Paul writes about there in the rest of chapter 9, the last few verses there, and also in chapter 10. But question 9 is a 3-part question here. Kind of do that when I run out of space. I just like to cram 3 into 1 so I can put more questions in here. But by what means have the Gentiles obtained righteousness? Yeah. How did Abraham attain righteousness? Same way, by faith, wasn't it? It was his faith in God. It was his faith in the promises of God that moved him to obey and led to him being blessed. And when, of course, Abraham did what God told him to do, God pronounced him as being pronounced him as being right in His sight. That's the Gentiles, and here you have, this contrast between these two groups. These Jews who are seeking righteousness, who are filled with knowledge when it comes to God and His law and sin and things like that. And then you have a Gentile world, and they really didn't care. They were these people this group of people who weren't really trying to obtain righteousness. They weren't trying to live by God's law, were they? Remember Romans chapter 1 when we read about the state of the Gentiles there? They were outside of this covenant that God had made with the Jews and the descendants of Abraham, and they were not doing what was right. But yet, when they heard about Jesus Christ, they believed it. They had faith. And so they became righteous in the sight of God. The second part of that number there, number 9, what kept Israel from obtaining righteousness?
They didn't have the faith.
And specifically, faith in who?
Jesus Christ.
Faith in Jesus Christ. They were so infatuated with the law of Moses. And, I feel like I talk about this every week, but I do because Paul writes about it as we're studying here. But they were so infatuated with the law of Moses that they missed the whole point of the law. I mean, what was the whole point of the law? Yeah, it pointed them toward Christ, didn't it? You want forgiveness? You want a perfect sacrifice? You want innocent blood? You want to be right in God's sight? This is where you need to go. And that's the whole point of the law, and they missed it. They were just so enamored with this idea. This is a law that God gave to us, and He's not given it to any other nation. And this law is special. So we're going to hold on to it no matter what. And when Jesus comes and he starts, preaching about this law is going to be done away with, that made them angry. And they rebelled. They rejected it and rebelled against him. But Jesus was trying to teach them, I'm the fulfillment of this law. It was a picture of me. It pointed you toward me. And so you don't need this law, you need me. And again, they were just so wrapped up in that idea that this law was so great and so special, and it was going to be their way of being right with God. So what did they stumble over? Third part of that question, well, Jesus. That was the stumbling stone, wasn't it? What positive trait? Question number 10. It's not that Israel was everything that they ever did, or even some of their attitudes were horrible. There were some positive things about them, right? What positive things does Paul describe about Israel here in this chapter? Yeah. Did they want to serve God? Yeah, they did. Didn't they? But the negative thing that he lists is what? Yeah, they didn't do it the way God told them to do it. They had this knowledge that was given to them by God, and they wanted to serve God, and they wanted to be His children, they wanted to be right in His sight. They didn't want to do it that way. They didn't know and they didn't understand that Jesus was the way that God was trying to make them right in His sight. And there are people like that in the world today too, aren't there? Are there a lot of good people who have a zeal for God? Yeah, they want to serve God, don't they? They want to be right in His sight. But the problem is you got to have divine knowledge to go along with it. We can't just go out here and say, well, I want to serve God and I want to do what's right, and so that whatever I do is going to make me acceptable in God's sight. That was kind of the Jewish attitude. But anyway, they instead of complying to God's way of making them right, they came up with their own way of being right in God's sight, didn't they? And do people do that in the world today too? Yeah, people are still doing that. Rejecting God's knowledge and saying, this is the way I'm going to be right with God. Well, there's only one way to be right. And so if it's not God's way, we're not going to be right with God. Question number 11. What does it take to get the message of God to someone?
Teaching.
Yeah, they've got to hear, don't they? They don't hear, they're never going to believe. Paul kind of goes and uses kind of a reverse order here when it comes to salvation, but he talks about how people who are going to be saved, and they're going to be saved by calling on the name of the Lord, and they're going to call on the name of the Lord by believing in Jesus, and they're going to believe in Jesus by hearing about Jesus, and they're going to hear about Jesus because somebody goes and tells them. And so Paul kind of, he goes backwards or goes in reverse when it comes to the order of salvation. But what Paul is pointing out here is he knew that the only way the Jews were going to be saved is if somebody told them. And Paul was willing to do that. Paul said, I'll tell them. Somebody's got to, somebody needs to. And I'll be the one who does it. They may not listen, but I'm going to tell them anyway. Question 12. So how have the Israelites responded to hearing the message of God? They heard, all right, but they didn't obey, did they? They didn't heed. They didn't listen to the things that God told them. That was, again, one of the main differences between them and the Gentiles. 13, how did Paul answer the argument that the Jews had not had an adequate opportunity to hear God's message? How did he disprove that? Maybe it was the case they just didn't hear. They didn't know. That was one of the arguments that Paul, or one of the objections that he anticipates.
He said that all the world has been taught
Well, I mean, the Israelites, yeah, the Jews had a long line of prophets that God had sent to them over and over again. They'd heard. In fact, he even quotes two of them here. He quotes from Isaiah and from Hosea. And of course, Moses talked about a lot about it too. But all those Old Testament prophets, the majority of those prophets went to the Jews, didn't they? And they told them. The problem wasn't that nobody told them. The problem was that they didn't hear. They didn't listen. They didn't heed and obey whenever they were told. Question 14. So how had the response of the Gentiles to the message of God differed from the response of the Jews?
Well, the Gentiles accepted, the Jews did not as a whole.
Yeah, this group of people who weren't really, like living their lives and being concerned with being right with God, like the Jews were. But when they heard the message, when they heard about Jesus Christ and making them right in God's sight, they obeyed, didn't they? And of course, the Jews rejected that. Most of the Jews, you think about this in the first century church, but most of the Jews, most of Israel rejected Jesus, didn't they? And they still do today. I often wonder, what do you think the ratio of the early church was, Jew versus Gentile?
Well, in the early church, you would believe that the Jew would outnumber the Gentile substantially. But the reality of the situation is, as time goes on, then the Jews continue to maintain kind of a status quo, while the Gentiles then tend to rise into a righteous position of belief and follow the Word of God.
Yeah. I would say, initially, like you said, well, when you're in Jerusalem and Judea and that area, you're mainly going to be dealing with Jews anyway. So initially, when it started, you had a tremendous number of Jewish converts, but as the gospel continued to spread, that number got smaller and smaller when you're comparing it to the Gentiles. But again, Paul looked at that, he just blew his mind. How can it be? This people who God promised all these things, people who were just had everything in front of them, and ended up killing God's son and rejecting the gospel. And it just tore him up, didn't it? All right, Lord willing, next week we'll finish the Israelites' place or the Jews' place in God's plan to make man righteous, chapter 11. And then chapter 12, Paul kind of transitions into that from chapter 8, how that rejoicing and the blessing should make us live as Christians. Anybody got any thoughts, comments, or anything before we end?